Well, this week, the Biden administration welcomed the Prime Minister of India to the White House, and it's a move that has been panned in some circles. And joining me to talk a little bit about what this meeting, what the White House hopes this meeting will do, and some of the reaction to it, is Ifran Nooruddin, a non-resident senior fellow in the South Asian Center at the Atlantic Council. Mr. Nooruddin, thank you for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So let's start off here with the basic question, and that is, why did the Biden administration decide that the time is right now to welcome Prime Minister Modi to the White House? It's the first time an Indian prime minister has been invited for a state dinner since 2009.
Prime Minister Modi has continued a policy of being friendly with the United States and deepening a partnership between the two countries that both recognize as potentially a major strategic partnership that could be definitive in the 21st century, especially as both of them recognize that China is a growing concern, a lot of opportunity where China is concerned, but definitely a lot of concern, and that they think that they are stronger together. So against that backdrop, you have a prime minister who's now been in office for 9 years. He goes up for re-election in 2024, and his predecessor had a state visit, and I think the Biden administration wanted to make sure that they afforded him with a similar honor to recognize the strong partnership of the two countries, and of course to do so before India and eventually the United States are in full re-election campaign mode. So I think the window for getting that done was increasingly tight, and they managed to squeeze it in now.
Well, you mentioned that he's going to be up for re-election next year, same as President Biden. What do Prime Minister Modi's prospects look like in terms of getting re-elected?
India is a parliamentary system, and so unlike President Biden, the party goes to the polls, and if the party has the largest number of seats, they get to choose their leader, which would be Mr. Modi. As of right now, a year ahead, all indications are that the BJP, which is the Bharatiya Janata Party, the Indian People's Party, Mr. Modi's party, is likely to be the largest party once again. There is no organized opposition to it. Mr. Modi himself is personally incredibly popular, and the party has a strong record that they're proud of. There will be much opposition. I mean, India is a very vibrant democracy, very competitive elections, and, we can't predict perfectly, but the indications right now is that Mr. Modi would come back for a third term. And the question really is sort of whether he's got a very big majority once again, or whether he has to govern in a coalition.
You mentioned China just a second ago as one of the main factors for the Biden administration welcoming Prime Minister Modi to the White House at this point. Do you think they're trying to send a message to China? And if so, what do you think that message is?
All visits of this level are sending messages all around the world, obviously, right? And China is paying attention. They recognize and would undoubtedly be noting a stronger, tighter defense relationship between the United States and India. Their concerns are less about India. I think Chinese strategists think that they've got a pretty significant military and economic advantage over India. But India coming more firmly into the American orbit, and in particular a stronger defense relationship, means that America now has assets to the west of China, in addition to the long investments in Japan and South Korea and in the Pacific. For China, that makes it more vulnerable because now it has to counter the United States, both on the west and in the east. And China is a very large country, so that's logistically quite difficult. So I think what the Chinese are going to be paying attention to is what actually is in the substance of the announcements made. We're expecting announcements to be made about defense production happening in India, maybe some technology transfer. I don't think they're going to be too put off by the rhetoric and by the pomp and circumstance, right? I mean, the glitz and glamour that accompany a state visit is fine. Okay, you did that. But what exactly are the brass tacks? What are you talking about? And I think anything that's far more about the United States having a deeper defense relationship, one that goes beyond simply, hey, this is a country we want to be pals with, right? But really are they going to be selling the top hardware? Are they going to be actually doing more joint military exercises? That's what China's paying attention to. From the United States' perspective, I would argue that the main audience for this is actually India. It's about reaffirming to India that the future for India should go through the United States, because the other goal over here is to slowly move India away from a dependence on Russian weapons. And so, the focus is China because that's the future, but the past affects the future as well. And the last year has reminded the United States that for all of the improvements in the relationship between India and the United States, India remains a staunch friend and partner to Russia. It has not been really part and parcel of the American-led sanctions against Russia for the war in Ukraine. It has held against any overt condemnation of the war. It refuses to refer to the war as a war, preferring all sorts of other euphemisms. And I think the United States wants to really roll out the red carpet and say, hey, if you want to be a great power in the 21st century, you have to be in our camp. You can't sort of, sit on the fence and also play nice with Russia when it's convenient.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're describing is a real opportunity for the United States to make inroads with perhaps their two chief rivals, the two countries that are causing the most concern, angst, agita among American officials. And it sounds as though, India's population growth also is expected to surpass China, I think I read in the next few years as well. So do you sense that as well, that there's an opportunity here for the United States to make inroads with these two nations?
Absolutely. Done right, the U.S.-India relationship is as close to a complete game changer on the world stage as any other, right? We know the main players. We know China is what it is. The United States is what it is. We know that NATO and Russia are what they are. The wild card, if you would, is India, which has long been recognized for the large population, for its economic potential, for the fact that it is a large military. But it has not declared its intentions, as it were, right? It has always prided itself. Once upon a time, they called it non-alignment. Now they refer to it as multi-alignment. Anything the United States can do to bring India off that fence more and more over to the United States adds a huge wildcard, a huge free agent, if you would, to the mix, and changes the dynamics of the global competition. But the key to making that happen is for the United States to slowly begin to ratchet up the pressure on India to say, we are happy to play the long game. We're happy to sort of provide you the ego strokes that a state visit is. We're happy not to talk about some of the awkward issues of democracy and human rights in your country. But all of that comes because you are going to show us that you are as serious about the relationship as we are. You're going to start buying more American weapon systems. You're going to stop buying Russian weapon systems. You're going to start doing more trade with the United States. And I think what we should be paying attention to is not getting distracted by some of the legitimate criticisms of, the optics of hosting the prime minister at a time when the country is under a lot of criticism for democratic backsliding, but focus really on whether that trade-off is worthwhile. What does the United States get in exchange for this? And I think on that one, the Biden administration has been vague on the details. We'll know a lot more by the end of this weekend. And then I think we can really assess whether the relationship is all that we hope it will be, or whether it's a lot of glitz and glamour and rhetoric, but not so much substance.
I did want to dig into just a little bit what you mentioned with regard to the democratic reforms or the human rights violations that many are upset about. And one of the reasons why there is some pushback to the Biden administration welcoming Prime Minister Modi to the White House does have to do with some of those issues. I know Democratic Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib said she will boycott any of the meetings that the Prime Minister is going to have with members of Congress. He's expected to deliver a speech to joint session this week as well. What is your reaction to why, I guess more to the point, why are some against the U.S. opening their arms to India in this way?
India is a complicated country, but one of its great strengths historically has been a commitment to diversity of religions, ethnicities, languages, right? Like the United States, it prides itself on unity and diversity. And anything that has undermined that religious tolerance has always engendered criticism. This is not unique to Mr. Modi. Previous governments have also toyed with some versions of religious polarization as an electoral strategy, and those have been criticized. India had a very significant religious minority wage a pretty active insurgency in Punjab in the 1980s, right? So it's a long-standing set of issues. But under Mr. Modi, there is a perception that India's record on religious tolerance has really gone in the wrong direction. Attacks against India's largest minority, Muslims, but also against its smaller minority groups, in particular Christians, have really ramped up, in the sense that the government machinery has been used to go after missionary organizations, Christian-linked organizations, by cutting off access to funding, has really gotten a lot of people, a pretty diverse coalition, actually, not just your progressive Rashida Tlaibs, but also conservative congressmen for whom issues of religious freedom are very, very important, to say, hey, what's going on over here? You also have attacks on the press, you have attacks on civil society. I do not want to suggest that this is somehow officially sanctioned by the Prime Minister, but it is a society that shows some drift towards illiberalism in ways that would be of concern to anyone who supports human rights and democracy around the world. For Mr. Biden, this is especially awkward because he has made a big deal of saying that this is really about democracy against authoritarianism in the 21st century, that democracy will be a fundamental part of American foreign policy. He's tried to draw a distinction between his version of that foreign policy and his predecessor, who he would argue was much more transactional about such issues. Well, if we take him at his word that democracy is going to be a hallmark of American foreign policy, then that invites, I think, legitimate questions about, well, is this the right optics for America? Earlier this week, Biden referred to Premier Xi of China as a dictator, right? Whether or not that's a right adjective, it once again just highlights that for this White House, democracy is a critical factor at a time when every international ratings organization has downgraded India's democracy away from a liberal democracy to what is now called an electoral democracy. It does beg questions about what exactly does the Biden administration think of India's human rights record? And once again, to come back to an earlier theme, John, whether that trade-off on some of those more liberal values is made up by the tangible gains that the relationship gets because we get a stronger defense partnership.
Last question for you. One of the United States' top allies in the war on terror back in the 2000s was Pakistan. And the relationship between India and Pakistan has always been one of the, I guess, for lack of a better word, one of the scarier foreign policy issues, just because of how badly things could go should tensions between those two nations over Kashmir explode in ways that nobody wants. What would the United States cozying up to India and establishing a more established defense relationship with India, how would Pakistan receive that?
Pakistan is, experiencing a pretty severe case of whiplash, right? I mean, they've gone from being America's favorite partner, maybe not the most reliable partner, but definitely a very strong partner for the war on terror. America's war in Afghanistan was made possible by the logistics support that Pakistan afforded it. Pakistan would argue that it bore a brunt of some of the cross-border terror violence engaged by Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Pakistan was obviously a major defense partner, a lot of acquisitions. And so for Pakistan, this does two things. One is that it essentially reminds them that they are no longer that favored partner. And in fact, are really kind of an afterthought. President Biden famously never called his counterpart, Prime Minister Imran Khan, the entire time Khan was in office, right, preferring to talk directly to the military establishment in Pakistan. So they recognize that, and that gets them very insecure vis-a-vis India, which, as you point out, John, is scary at a time when both countries have nuclear weapons and have gone to war before regularly. But the other factor is that it potentially pushes Pakistan deeper into a relationship with China, which, remember, also shares, via the Himalayan mountains, a border with both countries. China has invested tremendously in Pakistan's infrastructure. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. There's a lot of economic activity of China, and China doesn't ask questions about Pakistan's human rights record. It doesn't ask questions about the civilian-military balance in the country. And more importantly, it sees a real opportunity to undermine the Indian Ocean side of America's defense strategy by saying, hey, well, we can go around India and have a relationship with Pakistan. So I think what bears watching is whether the Biden administration can rebuild some of the bridges with Pakistan and say, hey, there's nothing that's going to move us away from India, but you don't have to see this as zero sum. We're happy to continue to work with you. And just as importantly, what role does China begin to play in Pakistan? Because that again is one of those things that when we think about the 21st century chessboard is something we can't quite predict. But if a China-Pakistan relationship becomes very strong, it gives China land access to all of Central Asia. It gives China land access to the Middle East in ways that would tell us once again that the United States, by focusing on the Pacific, has given up pretty traditional areas of influence. That could be for good, but at least it should not be unintentional.
Well, it's a fascinating part of the world that the United States is obviously keying in on right now with Russia and with China, the two main foes at the moment, the two main rivals for the United States at the moment. It's a fascinating decision to bring the Prime Minister of India here to the United States. So I really appreciate you breaking this down for us. Irfan Nooruddin, non-resident senior fellow in the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. Sir, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.